Now, we keep talking about this shocking housing crisis in this country. We've got low unemployment, stacks of tradies, plenty of willing customers. So what's the problem, right? Well, the problem is supply. We aren't constructing enough housing where we need it, of course. And the big question is why? And this is where governments often go to water. We all know why. It's governments, mainly local councils and state governments, who provide so many planning restrictions, so many hurdles, fees and conditions on every build, even on every renovation, and who flat out reject so many proposals to build units or subdivide blocks in the suburbs close to our city centres, where, of course, people want to live and work. We make it too hard to build houses or units in these areas, too expensive. We constrict supply, so prices go through the roof. Centre of Independent Studies Chief Economist Peter Tulip has looked at all this in a new report, and he's calling for government action, or really for government to get out of the way, remove some of the housing restrictions.
So there are so many of them. There are height limits, there are setback limits, there are use restrictions. They tell you what buildings can go where. It's a lot of different ways that they stop building, but the summary is that we're not allowing enough density, in particular in our inner suburbs. That's where the big demand for housing is, but it's reserved for single-family detached housing.
Isn't the issue here, though, that most voters, most taxpayers, most of the residents support this? There's a not in my backyard attitude, a NIMBY attitude, and local councils are knocking back higher density developments because the current residents don't want it?
So I think views differ, and I think a lot of people are inconsistent. So a lot of people recognise there's an affordability problem and a shortage. They just don't want it over their backyard. So we need to coordinate it. I think there would be acceptance of more housing if it was broadly shared. I think a lot of people are understandably resistant to extra density in their neighbourhood, but if it's shared generally, there'd be more acceptance of it.
Yeah, so state governments should put pressure on councils. In the end, they control the councils, and we should loosen up the planning restrictions, allow higher density accommodation to be built closer to the cities. Is that the obvious solution? And is government therefore the problem rather than the solution?
No, you've got it exactly right, Chris. And I think the best way to do it is for the state government to set targets for each council. And those targets need to be higher, and in particular, they need to be higher in the inner suburbs that are often the most wealthy suburbs.
And I suppose the bottom line is that we're going to do that eventually anyway. The cities just have to there has to be higher density in our cities over time rather than pushing people further and further to the outer suburbs, which creates all sorts of additional problems in supplying infrastructure and roads and electricity and sewerage and hospitals and schools and transport. It's much better to have higher density cities.
You're more optimistic than I am, saying that it's going to happen anyway. There's a lot that needs to be done before we get a better housing system. And in particular, I think what you said earlier is the public needs to be convinced that we have a huge affordability problem and the solution is to allow more density in our neighbourhoods.
Fantastic insight into this. Thanks so much for joining us, Peter.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, government's just got to get out of the way and free it up instead of pretending they can fix this by spending more government money on social housing or whatever. Get rid of all the rules and let people build some houses.